Good afternoon.
I want to make sure I'm pronouncing your last name right. Is it Sandu Kurmer?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, Ms. Sandu Kurmer, what you testified to initially this morning was all the items that you tested on this case, correct?
That's correct.
And so there were no other items that you tested that you didn't testify to today, right?
That's correct.
So it'd be accurate to say that you never tested any keys to the Dodge Durango.
No, ma'am, I did not.
And that's because they were never given to you to be tested, is that right?
That's correct.
Because if they were given to you, you would have tested them, right?
Yes, ma'am. If they were given to me for DNA testing, yes, I would.
All right. Now, just for a point of clarification, you stated that you looked at the various items on these two dates. One was June of 2015 and then April of 2016, or I guess it was March of 2016, and you did an inspection to see if there was any blood on these items, right?
On a few of the items, yes.
Not like the swabs, of course, but like the clothing, the gun,
Right.
magazine, right?
Right.
And when you do this inspection for blood, are you just sort of looking at it?
So the first inspection is visual, and if there is reason to believe there might be blood on it, then I proceed with the preliminary serology testing.
Okay, so with the example of the sweatshirt and then the pants from Tabitha Little's, which were items 35 and 38, you visually inspected them and did not see blood, is that right?
Those were tested in both rounds of testing. So in the first round of testing, I looked at them under what we call as the alternate light source. So when you take something and it's a dark room and it's a special lighting under special, different wavelengths, and when you look at an item of evidence, different stains show different kind of fluorescence. Blood usually is dark. So I did not see any of that kind of staining under the ALS. So in the first round of testing, it was reported that nothing of serological significance was observed on items 035 or 038.
Okay. Now, this was State's Exhibit 481, if I could just grab that real quick. And while she's finding it, I'll actually just put up this picture. This is State's 320. I'm sorry? Oh, I forgot. I'm so sorry. Thank you. May I approach the witness stand? Thank you. So I think you already identified this State's Exhibit 481, but that was the magazine from item AR1B, is that correct?
That's right. So it's item AR1B, which is a magazine.
All right. And so that correlates with this photograph, which is State's 321. Is that right?
Sure, that's a magazine.
Okay. Do you have any reason to believe that this isn't the same magazine that you were talking about as AR1B?
No, I don't.
Okay. And do you notice there, sort of at least at the bottom here of the screen, this white paper?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Did you do any testing with that white paper?
No, I did not.
Okay. And you would agree that there does seem to be, and it's so hard to see it on this, the way it's displayed here, but let me see if I zoom it a little bit. If it focuses better. There we go. That there is this sort of rust-colored substance on the bottom of that?
Yes.
Okay. And so you would agree that that could possibly be blood?
Sure.
But you don't know what it is because it wasn't tested, right?
That's right.
Okay. Let me just get that exhibit back before. All right. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the amplification process, okay? And I'm glad you brought that tray, because a lot of us who don't do this sort of work don't really know what that is.
Right.
So I want to talk, first of all, amplification is basically, like you stated, you take the original DNA and you replicate it or duplicate it, copy it over and over again. Is that right?
That's correct. So only the locations that we are testing for on the DNA, they are copied multiple times.
Okay. And so when you have your known DNA, that's what you're sort of duplicating over and over again, right? The known sample.
Both the known and the evidence samples are subject to the same testing. So they both are copied during the PCR process.
And the reason for that is what? Why do you copy both the known and the unknown samples over and over again?
To make enough copies so that you can get some kind of DNA information off of it, because the starting template is so minute. So in order to get enough of that to make any kind of DNA profile off of it, you need to copy it as per the validated cycles in the PCR process, which are validated by our lab.
Okay. And when you use that phrase, so minute, obviously, we have a different opinion. I may have a different opinion than you of what minute means. What exactly do you mean by so minute that you have to replicate it over and over again?
When I say what we actually use as input DNA is about 1/1,000,000th the size of a large paper clip. So if you would take this, it's 1/1,000,000th the size of this paper clip.
And and that's still sort of hard to understand if you don't do science, if you're not a scientist. Are we talking about the size of a eraser on a pencil, or a grain of salt, or even smaller?
It's even smaller than a grain of salt. It cannot be seen with the naked eye.
And so that is the DNA that you're taking, that's something that's smaller than a grain of salt, and you're replicating it or duplicating it over and over again in this process, right?
That's right.
And you're doing that both for the sample that they got from the suspects or people involved, and also from the items that are being tested to see if they match up, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And in this particular case, there were a number of items that were the unknown samples, and by unknown we don't know if they had DNA or not, right?
That's right, and also unknown because I don't know who it came from or who's in that sample, and they're the evidence items.
Okay, and so we have this number of unknown samples, and then we have 4 known samples, right?
That's right.
And by known is, we know because their mouths were swabbed and the DNA was pulled from their cheek, right?
That's correct.
And when we say there's 4 known, we know we've got one from Tabitha Littles, right?
That's correct.
Officer Greg Benner.
That's right.
We've got one from Andrew Romero.
Yes, ma'am.
And then from Mr. James Stalter.
Yes.
There were no other known samples that were ever given to you to compare against these unknowns, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So you did not have a known sample from an individual named Crystal Romero, did you?
No, I did not.
Or an unknown, or a known sample from an individual with the name of Michelle Jaramillo, either?
No, I did not.
Okay, so let's go through this amplification sheet. Did you bring your raw data, your notes?
Yes, I did. My bench notes. Yes,
Bench notes, thank you. So you have an amplification sheet, which at least on my copy looks like it's bait stamp 19.
Is that the amplification sheet from the first round of testing?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I do.
Okay, and so can I have her come off the bench, Your Honor, so we can go through it? Okay, if you can come down and bring that sheet with you, and also the tray, please.
Yep.
I'm going to put the amplification sheet up here, which is really hard to see. Let's see if I zoom in a little bit. There we go. Let me back up just a little bit. Okay, so basically this document we're looking at, which I will mark as Defendant's Exhibit B, for identification purposes, this amplification sheet is basically corresponds with this tray. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and so when I'm looking at the various items that have, you know, these numbers on here, that corresponds with the evidence that you're analyzing, as well as the known samples and the unknown samples are listed in each box, right?
The tube numbers, when I extract them, each sample, known or unknown, as well as the controls, are given a separate tube number. And that's what the tube numbers there correspond to for the different samples.
Okay. And so I'd like to go through each one of these so that we could demonstrate to the jury where each sample actually was. Okay. And, Your Honor, can I sort of pass this around through the jury as we're going through this testimony?
Let's give no objection.
Thank you. Okay. So looking at...
Yeah, I also pass this because this goes with that. It's
Oh, sure.
the cap. Sorry, sir.
All right. So what we're looking at are the various wells that are contained within that tray, right?
Right.
All right. So looking here, these first two columns here had nothing. Cell F3,
044.
and what was that?
That was the projectile recovered from Tabitha Little's.
Okay. And then we've got G3.
That was G11, lowercase a.
Do you know what that was?
They were the swabs.
Okay. H3.
SW1.
Now you would agree that that entire column that we just did, which is the third column, were all the unknown samples. Basically, you're trying to figure out whose DNA is in there, right?
Right.
Okay. Moving over to the next column, which is 4. A46626. What was that?
SW2.
And what did that correspond with?
I think it was one of the swabs, I believe.
Do you need to see your notes for that to be sure? Thank you.
Pardon me, what was that again?
I think we're on A4.
SW2, they were swabs.
Swaps. And then we've got B4.
S27 was SW3, swabs.
Okay. C4. 6628.
SW4, swabs.
D4, which is 6629.
SW5,
Swabs.
swabs.
E4, 6630.
SW6, swabs.
F4, which is 6631.
Was SW7, swabs.
G4, which is 6632.
SW8, swabs.
And H4, which is 6633.
SW9, swabs.
Okay, so you'd agree then that column 4 is also an unknown sample, meaning you don't know whose DNA it is yet.
That's correct.
All right, moving on to the fifth column, we've got A5, which is 6634.
SW10, swabs.
B5, which is 6635.
SW11, swabs,
Then we've got C5, which is 6636.
which was a reagent blank. That means it should not have any DNA in it, which is another control check.
All right, D5, 6637.
Was AR1B, which was the swab that I took from the magazine.
Okay. E5, 6638.
Item C1, which was the magazine.
F5, I'm sorry, yes, F56639.
Was AR1, the Beretta handgun.
Okay. And then G5, which is 6640.
Was another reagent blank to make sure there's no cross-contamination occurring.
H56641.
5641 was SW12, which I believe were swabs.
All right. So you'd agree then that this entire fifth column here are also unknowns as far as whose DNA is inside there?
That's correct.
Okay. Let's move on to column 6, which starting with A6 is 6642. What's that?
Item SW14, which is swabs.
B6, 6643.
SW43
Yeah, 6643.
SW14 swabs.
Okay. C6 is 6644.
That's another reagent blank, the quality check.
6645, which is in D6.
6645 was item 004. It was the known DNA standard from Greg Benner.
Okay. So D6 is Greg Benner's DNA, correct?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Okay. Now we go on to E6, which is 6646.
It's a reagent blank.
F6, which is 6647.
Item 059, which was James Stalter's known DNA standard.
Okay. G6, 6648.
Item 045, which was Tabitha Little's known DNA standard.
And then we've got this one here, which is H6, which is 6649.
Item 1AR1, which is Andrew Romero's known DNA standard.
Okay. So in column 6, you have some unknowns
That's right.
and some known DNA, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And so, don't move. Let me just grab this. So when we're talking about the wells that we just went through here, just so we're clear, we're talking about this 6th column.
Yeah,
So that's right here,
that's right.
right? And then you go down to the very bottom one, and this is where Mr. Romero's DNA allegedly was, right?
That's right.
And then you go up one and diagonal, and that's where the Beretta was? The Beretta DNA was, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so it's a difference of here H6 and F5, correct?
Correct. However, may I point something out?
Oh, we'll get to that in a
Okay.
sec. So that's basically the distance between these two, the known standard and the unknown standard.
That's right.
Okay, thank you. I think you can have a seat now. Thank you.
May I just explain something on that really quick? So when I am,
Let me just ask you the next question, okay? And then we can get to that in a second.
Objection. You can answer the question.
I didn't ask a question, Your Honor.
Let me bring it up and read it right.
Okay, and so you provided to the jury the snap thing that goes on top of each well.
right.
How long has DPS been using that thing?
I was trained to use that ever since my training.
Okay. And so when we're talking about this amplification process, after you put both the known and the unknown samples inside those wells, you snap that thing on top of each one, right? Each column.
That's right.
And then you take that tray, and that's when it gets heated up, right?
It's not just heated up. There's a cycle of heating and cooling, and every cycle has a certain amount of time that it heats up and cools for. So, yes.
Okay. So it gets really hot, and then it cools down. It gets really hot, and it cools down, and that's how you copy the DNA.
That's correct.
All right. Now, just so we can get an idea of how hot it gets inside those little wells, I mean, you're heating that to, is it about 200 degrees Fahrenheit? Does that sound about right?
I don't believe, I don't have the exact thing off the top of my head, but I can confirm that. I don't know if it gets that hot. I may be wrong.
Okay.
I can't recall
You're
off
not
of
sure,
the
but
top.
it gets pretty hot.
It gets hot, yes.
I mean, that's part of how the DNA is duplicated, is by the heat.
That's right.
Okay. And when it's heating and cooling, there's nothing different about that container, that tray, than what's been demonstrated to the jury. That is the condition it's in as it's heating and cooling, right? Do you understand my question?
No, I don't. Could you rephrase it?
Do you do anything else different with that tray besides what we showed the jury?
Well, these are special trays that have been validated by the manufacturers for use in this particular technology. And then we, through our validations, have deemed them fit enough to be used in that process.
But my question is, there's not anything else that is done with that tray besides what we looked at today. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. And so then after the DNA is duplicated, both the known and the unknown are duplicated in the same tray, right?
In the same tray, but different wells.
Right, like we just went through.
That's correct.
And so after you go through this sort of duplication process, that's when you start doing the testing, right?
The testing starts at the point I access the evidence.
Okay, maybe that was a bad choice of words. But basically, you peel off those caps, right?
They're peeled off one at a time, yes, and then they're injected into the next instrument that's called capillary electrophoresis.
Okay, and so you said you peel one of those caps off at a time, right?
That's right.
Okay, from which direction?
From the bottom up.
Okay, and from the sixth well to the first well or first to the sixth?
Different people do it differently, but most of us are trained to do it in the numerical order.
So 1 to 6, low to high?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, I imagine those trays that we were just talking about, there's a number of those that you have in your laboratory at your disposal. Is that right?
You mean they're disposable?
Do you have a lot of those in your
Yes,
lab?
we do.
Okay. And how much do they cost?
I have no idea. They come in packs of 10 or 12, I believe.
And, I mean, ultimately what you're trying to get at is to make sure you're doing an accurate analysis, right? You want to make sure that the DNA from the known standard is not contaminating the unknown standard, right? I mean, that's the goal.
Absolutely, yes.
Right. And you said that these things come in packs of 10, right? So you have them
Yes.
sitting around the lab, right?
They're not just anywhere in the lab. They're at all times shut and closed properly. They are in a separate room because the area designated for amplification is separate from the rest of the lab. Also, before I take out one of these and put it in the UV cross-linker individually and kill off all the DNA that might be there, would have gotten through all the previous sterilization processes, and to make sure there's actually nothing on it before I use it in my testing.
I guess what my question is more directed at is, it wouldn't be expensive for you to separate the known from the unknown in 2 different trays, would it? I mean, you could, theoretically, quite easily, given that you have a lot of these trays in your lab, put all these known standards, which are columns A3, or columns 3 through 5 and part of 6 in one tray, and then the known standards, that were swabbed from these 4 people in another tray. I mean, you could do that. It's not expensive, right?
It is expensive.
To use 2 trays.
To use 2 trays because of the mix that we use this in, the amplification kit, is very expensive. And in addition to that, we are not just running the master mix or this cocktail of chemicals that we are adding. We are also using the positive controls and the negative controls. And it's just not feasible to put them on separate trays. It's a 96 well plate. It's meant to be used with multiple samples. So it just makes more sense financially and time-wise to put them on one tray in separate wells and amplify them.
Now, you would agree that there are occasions when there is a contamination from one well to another, right? That's happened at your lab.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And the times that that's happened, there's actually been a contamination of one case, so let's say one murder case, contaminated another murder case by crossing
Your Honor,
both.
that's speculative, and that's beyond the scope of direct examination. It's improper at this point to do it.
She's an expert witness, and the state went into this quite a bit on their direct examination.
On another case, Your Honor?
I think you need to lay a foundation, not just do generalities.
Sure. So you're aware that there's been this contamination on another case where there's been some sort of crossover between the wells, right?
I'm not aware of that, but sure, if you say so.
Okay. So what is a corrective action form?
So like I said, all the controls that are run, and that's the beauty of having those controls, is that we catch the contaminations when they occur. And when they occur, all testing is ceased till the point we can assess the case and find out at what stage the contamination occurred. Did it occur during extraction? Did it occur during quantification? Or did it occur during PCR amplification? Because there are different steps in DNA testing. Once that is determined, this form that we have called corrective action is filled out. Where it happened, when it happened, how, and what can be done to prevent this from happening. That is then taken to the technical leader of the section and then to the QA manager. And they both have to sign off on it and make sure everything is what it is. It was outlined properly, and what was the result of this whole car form, and that has to be signed off and closed before any testing can proceed on that case.
Okay. And so you said you were aware of some contamination happening within the...
We have quality checks in place to catch any contamination that might occur.
So then describe, how would you catch a contamination in this particular circumstance? If there was a contamination from that known sample, which was Mr. Romero's DNA, to the Beretta, which is AR1, in P5, how would you have known there was contamination?
So even before the amplification occurred, after I have extracted the DNA from the Beretta, I took it through the process called quantification, where it tells me how much human DNA is there, and out of that human DNA, how much of it is human male DNA. And in that particular sample, even before it was amplified, I saw quite a bit of DNA. So when it was amplified and I got a DNA result, it just confirmed what I was already seeing in the previous testing process. So it correlates with that. On the other hand, item AR1B, which was I think in one of the wells right next to it, during quantification, the amount of human DNA that was detected was very low. And so when I typed the result, I did not get any result, or there wasn't sufficient DNA, which again confirms what I was seeing before the amplification. So it's not just one step. You have to look at the whole picture. And if I had a very little DNA during the quant process, but then I was getting a full profile mixture, that would throw red flags off. Also, one of the other things that we have at the lab, excuse me, is that all of the forensic scientists that work in the laboratory, not just in the DNA section, but in all of the other sections, their DNA is stored in a DNA database that we have. And every sample, before I look at it and compare it to a known standard, is first compared to the profiles in that database to make sure one of us did not contaminate the sample. So those are the precautions we take even before we actually report the results. And in this case, like I said, the quant results correlated with what I saw after the DNA amplification.
On these minute amounts of DNA, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Minute amounts that are so small that they can only be seen with the microscope, right? You said
the whole range that we look at There's a range between which we have to have, say, between 200 picograms to 2 nanograms. And that range itself is so minute that we are talking about very, like I said, a billionth of the weight of a large paperclip.
Okay. Now, what is an ART tip? A-R-T. What is that? Do you know what that is?
A-R-T?
A-R-T.
No, ma'am, I don't think I do.
So, do you know that there are, let me ask you this, what are aerosols?
Aerosols are anything that you can spray and the particles are floating all around.
So, have you not heard of an ART tip or an aerosol-resistant tip that goes on the end of the pipette?
Pardon me, sorry. We use generic terms in the lab. Yes, and I have actually one of those. That's what it looks like.
Okay.
So we do use that.
And so what's the purpose of the ART or the aerosol resistant tip?
So it's so minute, and the amount of liquid that I'm dispensing is so tiny that it makes sure that it's going into the well and right there and not just spraying all around. I think that's the extent of which I know. I'm sorry.
Okay. And that's because you don't want any of these little teeny tiny droplets basically moving around, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Because the little teeny tiny droplet could technically move from one well to another if you're not careful.
That's right.
And because we're talking in such minute amounts, a little tiny movement of a little tiny droplet could make a difference in your results, couldn't they? Couldn't it?
Depends on which stage, again, this teeny tiny droplet was floating around.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk about in the amplification stage. If a little teeny tiny droplet moved from one well to another, it could impact your results, couldn't it?
Well, I'll that was put into the well here, and then this cap was fit onto that, and then Mr. Andrew Romero's standard was in the next column on the bottom well, where this column was already capped at the point. So there couldn't have been anything just floating around there and just dropping in that one well.
But what I'm asking you is, my question is a little teeny tiny droplet moving from one well to another during the amplification process could impact your results, couldn't it?
Sure it could.
Now, you talked about the touch DNA. Now, touch DNA is basically skin cells, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you would agree that skin cells, I mean, we're losing a lot of skin cells at all times, right?
That's correct.
And just me from touching this podium briefly, I'm going to likely have left some DNA on this podium, right?
More than likely, yes, ma'am.
And it can even get trapped on your clothing, in your hair, on your shoes. I mean, it's kind of gross, but our skin cells are pretty much everywhere.
That's right.
And skin cells, or this touch DNA, can linger for a period of time, right?
That's correct.
You can't really say with any certainty whatsoever when those skin cells were deposited on any given item.
That's right.
All right, let's talk about some of these items specifically. Item G11A, those are the Cheetos, right?
The G11 uppercase A is the stain from the Cheetos bag.
Okay. And you did 2 separate tests on the Cheetos bag.
Yes, I did.
And one of them was it ended up being blood spatter on there, right?
G11A was a stain, yes ma'am.
And G11B was when you open the chip bag, the opening that you stick your hand in, right?
That's correct.
And G11B, you got two individuals, two DNA from two different individuals, right?
Yes ma'am, a DNA mixture of at least 2 individuals was observed.
And so you said that Officer Benner's DNA was there, correct?
He was the source of the major DNA profile that was resolved from that item.
And then you said that Tabitha Little's cannot be eliminated. And that's just basically a way of saying that in all likelihood that was her DNA, right?
It means that at all the locations of the DNA that had all the information and there was no indication of anything missing, her DNA profile or markers were accounted for.
Okay. And no one else's DNA that you could analyze from that chip bag where you stick your hand, right?
I only had the 4 DNA standards. So if there was another unknown person there, I cannot make that determination. I was given 4 standards and I could only compare it to those 4 standards.
All right, so DSW1. DSW1 is the swab from the driver door handle exterior of the Dodge Durango, right?
DS1 swab from the driver door handle exterior. Yes, it is.
And so you compared the 4 known standards that we've talked about to that outside door handle, and you found that there were 3 profiles, right? At least 3.
I did not compare them to the 4 known standards because the DNA mixture of at least 3 individuals was present. However, the quantity of the DNA was not sufficient for me to make any kind of determination or comparisons.
Okay. So basically you don't know whose DNA it was.
I could not make any conclusions.
Now you've got DSW5, which is the rear driver side door handle outside, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And that also is basically like the driver door handle where there's at least 3 people, but you don't know whose it is.
That's correct.
Same with almost the same with DSW4, which was the passenger side door handle on the inside of the Durango. There's at least 3 profiles, and you could not rule out Tabitha Little's or Andrew Romero, right?
So in this case, I could make some kind of comparisons. So on DSW4, a DNA mixture of 3 individuals was obtained, but there was enough for me to compare it to the 4 profiles and make the determination that Tabitha Little's and Andrew Romero could not be eliminated as possible contributors to that mixture.
So just so the jury can understand how you actually get the DNA, and let's limit it to the Beretta. Okay, so that's AR1, right?
Yes, ma'am.
AR1. You swab the gun itself, right?
I swabbed the areas of the gun where a user would most likely handle it, and also where their DNA would be most likely to be deposited, but because a lot of times, especially the grip, has all these grooves which are awesome for storing all the skin cells that get caught in those little grooves.
Okay. So you're using, is it a cotton swab you're using or a Q-tip of some sort? What do you use to test those different areas of the gun?
So it looks like a Q-tip, It's a single-tipped cotton swab. However, these are specially made for DNA testing because they are sterilized, and then we autoclave it to make sure that we've killed all of the DNA on it. And so those special cotton tips are what I use, and it's moistened with sterile water, and then I swab it for the touch DNA.
Okay, and then you take the cotton or whatever that sort of fabric is on the end, and then you cut it.
We have disposable razors, and you only use one razor for one item, and then you toss it away into a shop's container. So I'm not tossing it away anyway. And then you cut the entire swab that you've used. The entire swab is used, put in a little, excuse me, in a sterile autoclaved UV tube.
Okay. And so it's actually the fabric itself that you put into the little well?
Yes, ma'am.
And that's what you use to amplify or duplicate the DNA, or whatever substance is on there, right?
Once I've extracted the DNA off of that swab and quantified it, and then I amplify it, yes.
Okay. And you work at the Department of Public Safety with a lot of the other technicians, like the guys who do the fingerprints, right? They work in the same place as you?
Their discipline is in a separate part of the lab, yes,
But
ma'am.
you're in the same building?
Same building.
Okay.
We don't have the money to move into a separate building. Sorry.
And so when items come into Department of Public Safety for various testing, there's a protocol for which those items move through the various personnel at Department of Public Safety, right?
You mean if different kinds of testings are ordered?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, ma'am.
And so in this particular case, where you're going to be looking for prints and DNA, you'd agree that the items went to fingerprints or latents before it came to you, right?
That's correct.
You talked a little bit about this review process that you have at the Department of Public Safety on your results.
Yes,
right?
ma'am.
And just so we're clear, you have the certain rules that you have to follow as far as testing DNA, but your actual work, what you're actually doing, that's not being videotaped or somehow recorded, is it?
All of the testing is on paper. All the data, the raw data, is looked at.
Right. So when you talk about that first review, what someone is actually doing is looking at your paperwork you created from your analysis to make sure you did it right.
That's right, and also they're looking at all the quality checks that are in place, that they were all followed, and they are giving the results that they should.
Okay. And then the second review, as you stated, is a review to make sure there's no typos on your final report that's going off to the agency that requested it, right?
That's right.
May I have a moment, Your Honor? Okay. Now, back to the Beretta AR-1.
Yes, ma'am.
There were 3 other individuals on the grip, the slide, and the trigger that you couldn't identify. Is that correct?
I'm sorry. There was a DNA mixture of 2 or more individuals that was obtained from item AR1, and to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, Andrew Romero was the source of the major DNA profile, and no interpretation could be made regarding the minor component.
Okay, and so you know, talking about the minor profile, you know that there were at least 2 other people, you just don't know who they were, right?
There was at least one other person.
One other person.
And no, it wasn't enough or sufficient DNA from them for me to make that determination.
And so just so we can distinguish the difference between a major and a minor, major just means there's more of it, right? There's just more, comparing major and minor, there's just more DNA, right?
That's right, but not just that. When I'm looking at the DNA profile, the major, and this is where, you know, a lot of scientific jargon like peak height ratios and peaks come into play. I also have to look at, are they actually showing up? Can I actually pull out the donors or the person who I'm calling major, their complete DNA profile from the mixture?
Okay, but you know, just because like you described to the jury, there's basically these peaks.
Yes, ma'am.
As you go through it. And so each person has their own unique DNA. And like you said, mom and dad each give 1 chromosome, right?
Yes, ma'am.
You can't have 3, I mean, I guess you could have 3 chromosomes, but...
In rare cases,
rare
yes, ma'am.
cases. But if you're seeing that extra peak in there, that means there's somebody else that's handled that firearm, or that's had their DNA on that firearm, right?
And that comes to the minor component. There is another person, maybe more. I just couldn't make any kind of conclusions.
Okay. So you don't know if that other peak, that other DNA on there belonged to Tabitha Little's?
No, I don't.
Or anybody else that you were not provided their DNA, right?
Sure.
Nothing further, thank you. This is yours.
Senator Kermer, you were asked a question but weren't allowed to answer regarding the distance between the gun and Andrew Romero, that portion there. Did you have some, I mean, what were you indicating?
Well, like I said again, in this, the Beretta, the sample from the Beretta handgun was an F5. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, F. And after I had deposited or dispensed the volume for the sample from the Beretta handgun, it was capped. So it wasn't open to any other droplets just falling in from what I did after this column. And Mr. Romero's DNA standard went in this well. At that time, this was already closed. So it doesn't really matter how far they were. The fact is that in between that and the Beretta handgun also, there was a reagent blank. And for me to have gone over that, it's not very likely. Also, the DNA profile or mixture that I saw correlated with what I was seeing before the amplification was even started.
Okay. Now, they've indicated that on that particular cell row, the AR-1B, the magazine, and the C1 magazine was above the handgun. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Let me just make sure. Yeah, so those were sample tube numbers 6637 and 38.
And if that were true, then what defense is arguing at this point, or assuming, or would the sample also be contaminated? Yeah. Okay. I'm not arguing with it. Okay. Would not the magazines also have Andrew Romero, since you've capped them, would they also have Andrew Romero's DNA in them, if that were true?
I'm sorry, sir. We perform we adhere to a certain standard of quality, and I don't think we let any random DNA just float around and land in whichever cell it or well it wants to land in. That's why we have quality standards, and that's why we have these checks, and we have these peer reviews to make sure stuff like that does not happen, or we could lose our accreditation.
I guess the one the defense is arguing is, of course, the handgun. And the statistical information... Okay. The fact that you cap as you go along, you were asked about the possibilities of contamination in this case, correct? That's
I
Yeah.
believe, yes.
in this case, was there any contamination that you know of?
None of the quality control checks came back to show any sign of contamination. All of the data that was finally analyzed correlated with the data that was at Quant. All the precautions were taken, and to my knowledge, there was no contamination in this case. And yes, so yeah, no.
So your conclusions regarding that at certain points of your testing, that it was Greg Benner as the major source of DNA in the Cheetos, that was done correctly, to your knowledge?
Yes, sir, it was.
And when you indicate that Tabitha Little's was the major source of DNA, that was done correctly. Was that done correctly, Miss?
On what item of?
Well, anything that has Tabitha Little's name.
Yes, it was.
Now, you indicated that there are checks that you have when you do DNA reports. They go through an administrative review, a technical review. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Was this done in this case?
Absolutely, in both rounds of testing.
Okay. And going back to the handgun, what was the statistical numbers for where you came up to reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Asked and answered.
I haven't asked it this time, Judge.
So you mean on the major DNA that was
Right.
found? Okay. For the major DNA profile that was found on item AR1, the most conservative number was 1 in 1.8 quintillion individuals.
Okay. Now, throughout all this testing, basically, Ms. Senator Kermer, is it true or not true that Mr. Romero was the major DNA contributor in the handgun and the steering wheel of the vehicle to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
He was the source of the major DNA profile on item AR1, the Beretta handgun, and item DSW9, which were the swabs from the steering wheel. To a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, Andrew Romero was the source of the major DNA profile that was resolved.
Okay. Now, you went into great length about samples and different samples that you may not have had with you to test, correct? That's what they're asking.
That were not submitted?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, Ms. Sandra Kermer, in your experience as an expert in DNA, forensic DNA, can a female pass themselves off with male DNA?
Objection to the form of the question.
It's an open-ended question, Your Honor. What can...
Could you rephrase the question, please?
If you're a female and you give off DNA, would it come off as a female in your testing or a male?
Well, sir, a lot of things come into play then. Most commonly, a female shows only 2 X's and a male is 1X, 1Y. However, if they have a rare genetic defect or they were born a biological male, in that case, depending, maybe they identify as a woman, their DNA would be a biological male. So
Okay. Now, again, well, I have no further questions.
Can this witness be excused and released, Mr. Lopez?
By the State, Your Honor.
Yes.
Let me say that we agree with this.
Thank you.
Your Honor, if we can approach.
From the testimony you're about to give is the truth and the penalty of law.
I do, sir.
Go ahead and take a seat.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Could you please state your name for the record and please spell your first and last name?
Nathan Lerner, Nathan-Lerner.
Can you get the mic a little bit closer to you?
And where are you employed?
I work for the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department.
In what capacity do you work for Bernalillo County Sheriff's?
I am the supervisor of the Special Investigations Unit.
Okay. And as part of your duties in the Special Investigations Unit, are you required to have knowledge of jail recordings that may be kept at the Metropolitan Detention Center?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Are you aware of those recordings, whether or not they are made automatically?
They are made automatically as an agreement between Securus, the company, and the facility.
And is it a routine practice for the jail to keep those recordings?
Yes, they do.
And are those recordings made simultaneously with the conversations that are recorded?
Yes, I believe everything is recorded up there on the telephones.
And they're recorded, how are they preserved after they're recorded?
They're preserved, I believe, on a server, and they're preserved, the actual recordings are preserved for a year. The data, I believe, is preserved for over 2 years.
Okay. And so the recordings are electronically, the conversations are electronically recorded?
Yes, ma'am.
As part of your duties there, because of your position there, I should say, do you sometimes get requests from law enforcement officers to either monitor or obtain recordings of inmate jail calls?
Yes, we do. We get requests from law enforcement officers from throughout the metropolitan area, and we'll just send them the phone calls.
What about outside the metropolitan area?
Outside the metropolitan area also, if they're housed at MDC, they'll call us, we'll ask them, and we'll send them the phone calls.
When you get a request like that, how do you obtain, say someone calls and asks for a particular inmate's phone calls, how do you know what phone calls to obtain?
Well, I ask for dates, and they'll tell me the dates they're in the facility. I'll ask what their name is, they'll tell me their name. I'll look their name up on their database, and they'll give an inmate number on it. And I'll put the inmate number into the system, and the system will come up with all the phone calls he made off that number, or she made off that number, and they will send it, and I will save it, and then I'll send it to the detective who requests it.
Okay, now, when you obtain them, how are they actually physically delivered to you, if that makes sense?
They're not actually physically delivered to me. They're on the server. What I'll do is disk, and if he doesn't put it on a disk, it expires.
Okay, thank you. And did you ever receive a request from Detective Rick Romero of the Rio Rancho Police Department?
Yes, I did.
And what did he ask you to obtain?
He asked me just to obtain the phone calls that are made by the person he's investigating.
And who is that?
That person was Mr. Andrew Romero.
And did you obtain those phone calls?
I believe I did. I think I sent him 4 calls, and I just emailed them to him.
So you went through the same process as you described? You accessed it and then pushed send to Detective
Yes.
Romero?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Pass the witness.
Oh, okay. I apologize. Good afternoon, officer.
Good afternoon, sir.
Is it agent, officer, deputy?
Deputy or sergeant, whatever you want to call me, sir.
No, sergeant. for sure.
Sergeant, sir.
All right. So when you make a request to MDC, the specific request is for name or inmate number, right?
You look them up on the MDC database, and it comes up with inmate and number. Let's say, for instance, it's me. Look me up, Nathan Lerner, and it comes up my number 11111.
Okay. And is that the PIN number that the individual will use when they're identifying themselves for the secure system?
I believe there's 2 numbers in there you can use. You can use the inmate number and the PIN number.
Okay.
But the inmate number is shorter than the inmate number and the PIN number.
Okay. And in your experience or your expertise as BCSO in handling these inmate requests, have you ever become familiar with the time when one inmate might use another inmate's PIN number?
Yes, I have.
And familiar with the time or familiar in your experience with inmates using other inmates' only PIN numbers, but they're inmate numbers, right?
Yeah, they switch numbers to and from sometimes because they don't want people to listen to their phone calls.
Okay. Or because somebody doesn't have enough money left on their phone card, right?
Yes, sir, but in some particular reasons, with Securus, there is a option where they can either call them collect, or their family will put money on their account and dictate, the family dictates who they call.
Sure. So it can be for both a nefarious reason to try to cover up their calls or who the identity of the caller is, or just because they don't have any dough on their phone card, right?
Sometimes, yes.
So nefarious and unnefarious, but you've seen both of these things.
Yes, I
in
have,
the
sir.
course of handling these requests, right?
Yes, sir.
All right, very good. Thank you.
No redirect, Your Honor.
We need to hold this witness up here, or is she free to go?
He's free to go, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Show me on this witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state calls Detective Rick Romero.
And counsel, put your bench before you go.
Good afternoon.
Please introduce yourself to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury.
Yes, my name is Richard Romero. I go by Rick Romero.
Where do you work, sir?
The Rio Rancho Police Department.
And how long have you been with the Rio Rancho Police Department?
Roughly out of 18 years, 9 years there.
And before there?
Before there, I was a sergeant with the Las Vegas Police Department in New Mexico. I was a supervisor for the investigation section there when I left.
And before you joined the Las Vegas Police Department, did you have any prior law enforcement experience?
I did. I was in the United States Army as a military police officer for 5 years.
Detective Romero, do you have any specific area that you are assigned to as a detective with Rio Rancho?
Yes, I'm currently assigned with detectives for Rio Rancho and also as part of the SWAT team. As an assignment with Rio Rancho, I'm investigate everything from property crimes to violent crimes. As of right now, I am assigned to the property crime section.
Do you have any training or experience, well, let me rephrase it. Do you have any experience teaching or instructing other officers?
I do. I'm an instructor with the department. I've instructed at the New Mexico Law Enforcement Academy. I've also instructed at the Albuquerque Police Department Academy in things such as scenario-based training as far as how officers respond to calls, how traffic stops are conducted, and also tactics as well. Through the SWAT team, we teach a lot of our department different tactics within the department.
Detective Romero, I want to take you back to last Memorial Day of 2015. Of course, you're aware of what that day was for the department?
Yes, ma'am.
What was how did you become involved in the case, and what was your role?
So around 9:50 p.m. on that night, I received a telephone call from one of the investigation sergeants, and that was Sergeant Rodney Montoya. He had called me explaining what had occurred, that Officer Benner had been shot. At the time, didn't really know the status of what his status was, and they needed me to respond to the area of Esterbone Library in regards to what occurred.
And were you, when you arrived there, were you ultimately given an assignment?
Yes, I was. When I arrived on scene, we were still gathering information as far as what actually had occurred. I received an initial briefing that possibly a carjacking occurred and that a female, who I didn't know at the time, was also shot. So that was the initial briefing that I was receiving. At that point, I was assigned by one of the sergeants on scene to act as the lead detective in regards to the case for our agency.
And did you have another detective assisting you in that capacity?
As far as
acting as, assisting you in your duties as lead detective?
Yes, so it was a unique situation because due to the circumstances, we had multi-agency and multi-jurisdictional response. We had numerous people from different agencies to include federal agents, to include U.S. Marshals and the FBI. We had a lot of people on scene from these agencies that were wanting to assist with us. When the decision was made that state police would in fact handle all the evidentiary processing at the scene, it was determined that I would be the lead detective for our agency, Rio Rancho Police Department, and that agent, Steve Montano, would be the lead detective for the state police on their side, and we would act as a liaison between each other in regards to that.
Now, you said after your initial briefing, you first had information that there might have been a carjacking of some sort. Were you also investigating or any particular lead as far as a name of a suspect?
When I arrived on scene, the initial briefing that I received is that a traffic stop had occurred. They believe it might have been possibly at Arby's, and that we had a secondary crime scene there, and also at a primary crime scene, where the shooting took place. At that location, I was briefed on that, and I was also given the name of an Albert Frequez or Fresquez that we were possibly looking for at that time, due to the fact that Officer Benner had run that individual over the radio and through his MDT, which is his mobile data computer that's inside your unit.
Now,
Ms. Romero, can you pull a microphone closer to you?
oh, sure. Is that better?
Thank you.
Sure. So at some point, did you learn that the name Albert Fresquez was not the name that you needed to be looking for?
Yes, ma'am.
And how did you obtain that information?
I obtained that information through Detective Dennis Park, who was at the hospital, UNMH, who was trying to gather information on what actually occurred. He was talking to the female who we later identified as Tabitha Littles.
Okay. And so did you obtain the information, details about, well, what details did you obtain, identifiers, if you will, of what suspect and what vehicle you were looking for?
So initially, Detective Park was on scene. I called him to try to get better information on what we were looking for, who we were looking for, the type of vehicle. He says, look, I don't have this yet. I'm trying to find this out myself. So we waited quite some time. Detective Park was able to give me a call back and provided me with the information that we needed to look for a suspect identified as Andrew Romero, and also a vehicle.
Okay. And were you given any details as far as what Mr. Romero was last seen wearing?
Yes. I was given information, and I also conducted a briefing with everybody on scene as to who we were looking for and what he was wearing. I was giving information as far as Andrew Romero and what he was wearing, which include a gray, white, and blue Jordans shoes, blue jean shorts, and a white tank top, or how some people call them, a wife beater. Also, I was given information about a possible phone number that he might have had, and I was also given information of the vehicle that he was possibly in, which was described as I believe, a 1999 Dodge Durango with a license plate of 331 RAT. I was also given information that the vehicle was brownish gray in color, and that it had a cracked windshield. And also in the back of the vehicle, in the rear window, was a C&M sticker. We were also provided information that the back windows were tinted on the vehicle. And this was obtained from Dennis Park, from Dennis Park, who obtained it from Tabitha Littles.
Okay. And again, with that information, you conducted a briefing, and what else did you do?
At that point, I conducted a briefing with all the agencies. There's a lot of people there looking for work and trying to figure out what we needed to look for. At that point, I believe APD Intelligence was there, and actually came up with information in regards to Andrew Romero with a date of birth and a picture.
Okay. So that information was disseminated, and then as part of your role as lead detective, what other tasks did you personally do?
At that point on scene, I know I did assist with, at times with a grid search. What we do is, while we were waiting for assignments and what to do, we were trying to find things to do. And at that point, I assisted with a grid search from the Arby's location all the way, which is the secondary crime scene, all the way to the primary crime scene where Officer Benner was shot and where his vehicle were at. I assisted within a search of those parking lots in that whole business area at that time.
Okay. And did you also conduct interviews?
At that time, no, I didn't. I did later on. Later on in the night, I learned that Andrew Romero had been detained, at a traffic stop, and I was told that he was being transported to the state police offices for interview, and I was assigned to go down there and meet with Agent Steve Montano and basically observe the interview at that point.
Okay. Now, when you say you observed it, were you inside the interviewing room?
No, ma'am. I was. So there's inside their office, state police officers, there is 2 interview rooms, and there's in the middle is a viewing room, and it's separated by 2-way glass on each side. So I can monitor one interview in one room, and also monitor an interview in another room through a 2-way glass.
And what, without saying anything that might have been said, were you able to observe the defendant's demeanor throughout the interview?
I did. I was there for a while observing the interview.
Okay, and what was his demeanor?
At times he seemed aware, at times nonchalant about what was going on, at times upset. That's how he appeared to me.
And were you observing, when you say observing, were you also able to hear, so you could hear Mr. Romero speaking? Information that at the time of this incident, Mr. Romero had an outstanding bench warrant for a probation violation?
I did.
Your Honor, objection, subject to previous rulings.
This is State's Exhibit 486, which over counsel's objection I would proffer. I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 486.
Yes, ma'am.
Oops, wrong way. I guess that's... Does that look like the document that you obtained or that you used to confirm that Mr. Romero was in fact, that there was in fact a bench warrant outstanding for Mr. Romero at the time of the
Yes,
incident?
ma'am. This is a bench warrant for failure to comply with conditions of probation.
And can you see on there the date that it was issued? I'm not sure. I have to move that down a little bit. On the top there.
March 6th of 2015 at 2:40 p.m.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll put that up one more time. Also, can you see the address that's listed there for Mr. Romero?
Yes, ma'am. It's 4808 Braniff Northwest, Albuquerque, New Mexico, 87114.
And as part of your investigation, were you made aware of where the Dodge Durango was eventually found?
I was aware.
Okay. And these are, I'm offering, Your Honor, I believe it's been stipulated to States Exhibit 449 and 450. And do you see there, Detective Romero, that it lists both the location of where the Durango was found as well as Mr. Romero's address as it's indicated on the bench warrant?
Yes, yes, ma'am. The same address of 4808 Braniff Avenue Northwest is the same as it is on the bench warrant.
And the 10628 Kavanaugh Drive Northwest, do you know the significance of that?
Yes, ma'am. That was where the vehicle was located
The
and
Durango?
found.
The
Sorry?
Durango?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yeah, the Dodge Durango.
And then is that another view of the same?
It is.
Does it indicate there how far apart those two addresses are?
It's roughly a little over a mile, 1.3 miles away, which isn't very far. And it says 4 minutes by car.
Now, you mentioned a little bit earlier, a little bit about your role, I guess, as training officers on stops. Are there different kinds of stops that you train officers on and how to respond to those stops?
There is. There's different tactics to approaching a vehicle when you're conducting traffic stops.
Okay, if it's a routine traffic stop, what do you teach officers to do in relation to the number of parties in the car, adults, for example?
Well, first thing, no, we always talk, there's no routine traffic stop. And that's a term that other people use. You have to be aware on every traffic stop. We do teach different ways of approaching vehicles for a person that's maybe one person inside the vehicle, two people inside the vehicle, or others who could be possibly in a backseat of a vehicle.
Okay. So, and obviously you don't know what Officer Benner was thinking or perceiving the night he was killed, correct?
No, ma'am, I don't.
If you were training a new officer on how to approach a vehicle that had a skip plate and where one of the individuals had already given a false information, what would be your training? How would you train them to respond as far as approaching the vehicle, first of all?
Well, off of the information that you have, there's numerous things that occur, numerous situations that you can deal with. Obviously, you got to be you have to have a heightened state of awareness due to the fact that you're having problems with the people inside the vehicle. So your approach can be different as far as, are you going to approach on the driver's side, or are you going to approach on the passenger side to try to get a better view of that vehicle? Also, if there's multiple people in the vehicle and there's people in the back seats of the vehicle, you could do an approach from either one of those sides, the driver's side or the passenger side, but also making contact with them through the back window, having them roll down the back rear passenger or rear driver window and making contact with those individuals. That way you can see all individuals in the car clearly. One of the first things you want to do is clear their hands, make sure that there's obviously nothing in their hands at that point.
And what would be the training or proper protocol if there were other adults in the vehicle?
It's all situation dependent. If you're having people in the vehicle that are uncooperative, you could possibly approach that rear window and be making contact with the individuals inside the vehicle through that rear driver or passenger window, making contact with all the subjects inside the vehicle.
Detective Romero, when you, as part of your duties in this case, Did you have occasion to enter any items of evidence into the Rio Rancho evidence room?
Yes, can we go back to the other
Sure.
question real quick? I know you were asking me about what you would do in a situation where there were people in the rear of
Yes.
the vehicle. I forgot to mention also with that is if you were having people that are uncooperative in that vehicle, you would more than likely run those individuals, all individuals inside that vehicle, to see who you're dealing with.
Okay. And then again, and just maybe to clarify for the jury, we've heard that there's been testimony that items were collected by not only Rio Rancho but by the state police. Where was all of the evidence stored that was collected in this case?
So I would say a majority of the evidence, because state police was responsible for processing the crime scene, processing the vehicles and the persons that we obtained search warrants for, which would include Andrew Romero, Tabitha Littles, Michelle Candelaria, and Crystal Romero, that they collected the evidence and they signed over chain of custody to the Rio Rancho Police Department, where we maintained the evidence in our evidence vault.
Okay. Did you have occasion to enter in some of those items yourself?
I did.
Okay. And in particular, do you recall entering in a Durango key that was provided to the
Yes.
Rio Rancho Police Department?
Yes, ma'am.
And where did that Durango key come from to
When-
you? I'm sorry, I don't mean it originally, but I mean, how did it get to you?
When the vehicle was delivered, the Dodge Durango, to our department to be held in our lot, the key was with it?
Okay. And you entered that key into evidence?
Yes, ma'am.
May I approach the witness? I'm handing you what's been marked for identification as State's Exhibit 431. Could you take a look at that, please? Do you recognize that?
Yes, ma'am. This is item number 82. This is the key that I entered into evidence.
Your Honor, I would ask that at this time that State's Exhibit 431 be entered into evidence.
Without objection. You didn't do it.
Could you go ahead and open that up?
Yes, ma'am.
I need gloves too. Could you just step down for a second so I don't have to put gloves on? Put gloves on.
Do you want me to bring it?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Can you put it on the elbow so the jury can see? Let's place it on there. All right. And that is the key that you were given as part, that was your understanding that it belonged to the Dodge Durango?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. You can go ahead and take the stand.
Let me take it.
Yeah, take that and just put it back in the package and then hand it to Ms. As part of your investigation, did you ask to obtain jail calls for Mr. Romero from the Metropolitan Detention Center?
Yes, ma'am.
And who did you make that request to?
Sergeant Nathan Lerner.
And did he provide you with jail calls?
Yes, ma'am. He provided me with 4.
Okay. And did you listen to all 4 of them?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Okay. Now, how were you able to determine that the individual speaking well, can we approach for a second? Did you say 4? Or did you say 3?
It was 4.
4. When you listened to all 4 jail calls, did they all appear to be the same individual speaking?
They did.
Okay. And at this time, Your Honor, I would offer State's Exhibit 420, which is the jail call as modified per the court's order.
It's okay, at the very beginning it was blank.
No, there should be.
Could you just pause it for a second? Can we approach for a second?